Hello, welcome to the Purple Planet, where we help you drift into dreamland with the timeless and historical tales of queens, empresses, priestesses, and warriors from across the ages. In the early 12th century, while most of Europe was still shrouded in the somber routines of feudalism, the lands of Aquitaine basked in a gentler sun. Here, the air was perfumed with lavender and wild thyme, the horizon scored by river valleys and gently rolling vineyards. It was a world apart from the harsher, more rigid kingdoms to the north. Into this land, around 1122, was born Eleanor, Leonor in her native tongue, a girl destined to become both a product and a shaper of her time. The Duchy of Aquitaine, encompassing Poitou, Gascony, Saintonge, Limousin, and Auvergne, was perhaps the most coveted fiefdom in France. Its people were a blend of Gascon, Frank, and Visigothic stock, fiercely proud of their independence and their distinct Occitan language. The court at Poitiers, Eleanor's birthplace, was already famous for its refinement and its patronage of troubadours, those wandering poet-singers who crafted the ideals of courtly love, fin amour, that would echo throughout Europe. Eleanor's ancestry was illustrious. Her grandfather, William IX, was known as the Troubadour Duke, a man whose poetry scandalized the church and whose appetite for controversy was matched only by his love for beauty. William IX had been excommunicated more than once, both for his verses, one of which described a seduction in a convent, and for his open defiance of ecclesiastical authority. Yet he was also a patron of the arts, and his court set a standard for elegance and license that would mark Eleanor's upbringing. Her father, William X, Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitou, was a complex figure, pious, yet not above feudal violence, a lover of learning, yet quick to anger. He ruled a land where the authority of the Capuchin kings of France was little more than a polite fiction. The Duke's rule was often contested by ambitious vassals and the church. In 1134, for example, William the Kings supported the election of the reformist Pope Innocent II against the anti-Pope Anacletus II, and his conflict with the powerful Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux became a cause célèbre in the ecclesiastical politics of the age. Eleanor's mother, Eleanor de Châtellerault, daughter of the Viscount of Châtellerault, brought her own legacy of strength and intelligence. Through her, Eleanor was exposed to the intricate web of alliances that bound together the noble houses of southwestern France. Eleanor's own mother, Dangereuse, had been notorious for her affair with William IX, making Eleanor the granddaughter of a woman who defied social convention and left her mark on the court's culture. From her earliest years, Eleanor was aware of her unique position. She grew up in the stone halls of Poitiers, Bordeaux, and Saintes, surrounded by a court where women held a real influence. The Duchess and her ladies presided over poetry competitions, resolved disputes, and managed their own estates. Eleanor was tutored by learned clerics in Latin, scripture, and the law, an education rare even among noble girls. She learned to ride, to hunt, and to dance to the latest melodies from Provence and Languedoc. The chronicler Jean de Joinville would later write that she was as skilled in discourse as any man, and as wise in the ways of counsel. Her family's wealth was legendary. Aquitaine's prosperity came from its fertile lands, bustling ports, and a network of rivers that carried wine and salt to distant markets. The ducal treasury was filled not only with coin, but with precious tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and the relics of saints acquired from the pilgrimage roads that crossed the region. The Abbey of Saint-Hilaire at Poitiers was a center of learning and piety, and Eleanor's early letters reveal a deep familiarity with its libraries and its liturgical cycles. Yet the shadow of instability always lurked. The duchy's independence was precarious. The Capetian kings, based in the Ile-de-France, claimed suzerainty over Aquitaine, but their writ ran thin south of the Loire. The Plantagenets of Anjou, the Counts of Toulouse, and the Viscounts of Limoges all eyed Poitiers with envy. The church, too, was a force to be reckoned with. Bernard of Clairvaux himself traveled to Aquitaine to preach against the region's laxity and heresy, and the memory of Countess Philippa's exile for supporting reform still haunted the ducal family. Eleanor's childhood was marked by both privilege and loss. Her mother, Eleanor, died when Eleanor was still young, leaving her and her younger sister, Petronilla, in the care of their father and the formidable women of the court. William X, recognizing the dangers that might befall his daughters, took care to secure their inheritance. He made public displays of their status, parading them at feasts and ceremonies, and securing oaths of loyalty from his vassals. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis described a scene at Poitiers where the young Eleanor, arrayed in silks, presided over a gathering of lords and poets, her words keen as any man's. The court was alive with spectacle. On feast days, Eleanor would have watched tournaments in the tilt-yard, listened to minstrels recount the deeds of Charlemagne and Roland, and presided over banquets where larks and venison were served on gilded platters. She was present at the Easter councils in Limoges, where bishops debated the nature of grace and the limits of ducal authority. She saw her father negotiate with Castilian and Navarrese envoys, and she learned how to balance the competing claims of churchmen and knights. In 1137, as William X prepared to embark on pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, he faced a difficult decision. With no male heir, he knew that Eleanor's future and the future of Aquitaine depended on careful planning. He entrusted his daughters to the guardianship of King Louis VI of France, sending word north with trusted counselors and a sealed testament. William's pilgrimage was arduous, and he fell ill near Compostela. On his deathbed, he dictated his final wishes, charging King Louis to protect Eleanor and ensure her marriage to a worthy spouse. The news of William X's death sent shockwaves through Aquitaine. Eleanor, at 15, was now Duchess of Aquitaine and Countess of Poitou in her own right, the wealthiest and most eligible heiress in Christendom. Her lands were vast, her coffers full, and her hand became the most sought-after prize in Europe. Suitors arrived from every corner of France and beyond. Count Theobald of Champagne, the Count of Blois, and even the King of Aragon. Yet it was King Louis VI who moved most swiftly. Louis VI, known as the Fat, was a consummate statesman. He recognized that the union of Aquitaine and the French crown would create a dominion to rival any in Europe. He summoned his son, Prince Louis, to the court and dispatched trusted envoys, among them Abbot Suger, the king's chief advisor, to escort Eleanor north. The chronicles record the urgency of the king's orders. Let no man lay hands on the Duchess of Aquitaine, on pain of death. let her be brought in honor to our court. Thus began the journey that would transform Eleanor from Duchess to Queen and set her on a path that would entwine her fate with that of France, England, and the destiny of Europe itself. The passing of William X was more than a family tragedy. It was a turning point for two kingdoms. Eleanor, newly orphaned and barely 15, had inherited an empire of vineyards, rivers, forests, and castles, one that every ambitious prince in Europe coveted. But it was the French king, Louis VI, who acted first, aware that speed meant everything when the fate of Aquitaine hung in the balance. King Louis VI, called the Fat for his corpulence, but respected for his energy and cunning, wasted no time. He summoned his son and heir, Prince Louis, from his devotions. The young man was 17, tall, fair, and earnest, with a spiritual intensity that came from his childhood expectation of a monastic life. Only the untimely death of his elder brother had driven him from the cloister to the throne. Now he was dispatched south to claim his heiress. The marriage of Eleanor and Prince Louis took place on July 25th, 1137, in the great cathedral at Bordeaux. The wedding was a spectacle befitting the union of two realms: lords in brocaded surcoats, bishops in gold-threaded vestments, and the air thick with incense and song. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis wrote of Eleanor's beauty and high spirits, noting that she wore a robe of silk from Byzantium, her hair bound with pearls, her bearing already regal. A few weeks later, the old King Louis VI died in Paris. The suddenness of his passing elevated Eleanor to Queen of France before she had even learned the ways of the Capetian court. The young couple rode north to Reims for Louis VII's coronation. The journey was a procession through a land both awed and anxious, from the wild hills of the south to the somber, misty forests of the Ile-de-France, where the power of the monarchy was felt most keenly. Paris, Eleanor's new home, was a city in transition. The old Gallo-Roman walls still stood, but Abbot Suger, the king's mentor, had begun the transformation of the Ile de la Cité, raising the new abbey of Saint-Denis with its miraculous stained glass. The royal palace was grand but cold, its halls echoing with Latin prayers and the measured tread of clerics. Eleanor's arrival, with her retinue of troubadours, southern ladies, and minstrels, brought a flash of color and a shock of culture. The Parisians gossiped about her exotic ways, her laughter, her penchant for fine fabrics, and lively conversation. The Capetian court was very different from the open, cosmopolitan world Eleanor had known. Power here was more centralized, its rituals more severe. Louis VII himself was a man of contrasts, gentle yet obstinate, deeply religious, but easily swayed by his advisors. His chief counselor, Abbot Suger, was a brilliant administrator who saw the monarchy as an instrument of God's will. Suger admired Eleanor's intelligence, but he worried about her independence and the disruptive influence of her Aquitanian circle. From the outset, Eleanor found herself both queen and outsider. She strove to adapt, learning the court's expectations, presiding over feasts, and patronizing the Abbey of Saint-Denis. Yet she also clashed with the court's leading figures. When her sister Petronilla fell in love with Raoul of Vermandois, a powerful noble already married, Eleanor championed the match. The scandal led to papal condemnation, the excommunication of Raoul, and a long, bitter war in Champagne. The chronicler Suger lamented the queen's meddling, but it was clear that Eleanor would not abandon her own, even at the cost of royal reputation. Despite her efforts, the union between Eleanor and Louis was troubled. The Queen's lively spirit and taste for music, poetry, and the company of clever people contrasted painfully with the King's ascetic piety. Louis spent long hours in prayer and often retreated to the Abbey of Saint-Denis for counsel, leaving Eleanor to navigate a court that eyed her with suspicion. The Queen's southern manners, her easy discourse with knights, her fondness for tournaments and hunting, were misunderstood as frivolity or even impropriety. Still, Eleanor wielded real influence. She intervened in disputes, mediated between rival lords, and managed her own estates in Poitou and Aquitaine with remarkable skill. She was a patron of the arts, commissioning works in both Latin and the vernacular, and was said to have inspired the earliest songs of Marie de France. Chroniclers describe her as radiant and gracious, though often willful, and not always deferential to the expectations of queenship. The lack of a male heir cast a pall over the marriage. In 1145, after 8 years of union, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter, Marie, but hopes for a son faded with each passing year. The court whispered of divine displeasure, and some blamed the Queen for the failure, an injustice common to her age. Eleanor's letters from this period, preserved in fragments, reveal her anxiety and her determination to fulfill both her personal and dynastic roles. The crisis that would define their union came in 1147 with the call for the Second Crusade. The fall of Edessa to Muslim forces shocked Christendom, and Pope Eugenius III summoned the kings of the West to retake the Holy Land. Louis, eager to prove his piety and to atone for the violence inflicted on Champagne, took the cross. Eleanor insisted on joining him, not as a mere spectator, but as leader of her own contingent from Aquitaine. The journey east was epic and fraught with peril. Eleanor's presence was unprecedented. Never before had a queen brought so many female attendants, nor commanded such a visible role. The chronicler Odo of Duil, who accompanied the crusade, recorded her riding at the head of her vassals, armed and resolute. The Aquitanian knights, fiercely loyal, followed her banner, and the queen herself was said to have worn armor and dispensed judgment in camp. The hardships of the crusade tested every relationship. The march through Anatolia was a nightmare. Supplies ran low. The army was harried by Turkish raiders, and the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos offered little help. At Italia, many crusaders died of thirst and disease. Eleanor, through it all, remained a figure of courage and command, but the strain grew. At Antioch, Eleanor was reunited with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. Raymond's court was a dazzling outpost of French culture in the Levant, and the chroniclers noted the easy intimacy between uncle and niece. Rumors spread. Some accused Eleanor of plotting with Raymond to launch a southern campaign. Others whispered of an unnatural closeness. Louis, already suspicious and humiliated by military blunders, became deeply estranged from his wife. He abruptly forced her to leave Antioch, ending any chance of unity within the Crusader army. The rest of the campaign was a disaster. The failed siege of Damascus marked the collapse of Christian hopes in the East, and the royal couple's return to France was shrouded in bitterness. They traveled by separate routes, their marriage now little more than a formality. In the years that followed, attempts at reconciliation failed. The lack of a son, the mutual recriminations, and the persistent interference of the king's advisors made continued union impossible. In March 1152, at the Council of Beaugency, the marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, a legal fiction hiding deeper wounds. Their daughters, Marie and Alex, remained with Louis. Eleanor returned to Poitiers, once again sovereign duchess, but now a woman of experience, legend, and dangerous allure. The chroniclers of the time, from Suger to William of Newburgh, offered conflicting portraits. Some saw Eleanor as a troublemaker, others as a wronged woman, but all agreed that her story was far from over. As she rode south, she narrowly escaped abduction by Count Geoffrey of Anjou, an incident that underscored her value and her peril. Within weeks, she would take another husband, one whose ambitions and a temper would shape the destiny of England and France for decades to come. Eleanor's return to Poitiers in the spring of 1152 was not the quiet withdrawal of a defeated woman, but the swift, purposeful movement of a sovereign seeking to secure her future and her lands. The annulment from Louis VII left her the single most desirable marriage prize in Europe, but it also placed her in peril. The roads of Aquitaine were alive with rumor and threat. Not long after her return, as she traveled between her strongholds, she was pursued by Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, Henry Plantagenet's own father, who sought to capture and wed her by force, hoping to add Aquitaine to the Angevin patrimony. Eleanor evaded him, thanks to the speed of her retinue and the loyalty of her vassals. But the episode underscored the dangers of her position. It was Henry Plantagenet himself, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou and Maine, and already a formidable political force at just 19, who moved most decisively. Henry was the son of Empress Matilda, the daughter of Henry I of England, whose bitter civil war with Stephen of Blois, known as the Anarchy, had torn England apart for nearly 2 decades. The young duke was already showing signs of the relentless energy and will that would define his reign. He crossed the Channel to meet Eleanor, and their mutual attraction was as much political as personal. Chroniclers later hinted that Eleanor, seasoned by years at the Capuchin court and the ordeal of the Crusade, recognized in Henry a kindred spirit, ambitious, brilliant, and unyielding. Their marriage, celebrated at Poitiers Cathedral, just 8 weeks after Eleanor's annulment, shocked Europe. Not only had Eleanor chosen her own husband with unprecedented speed and independence, she had bound Aquitaine to the rising Angevin dynasty, creating a power block that threatened both the Capuchin crown and the regional nobility. Louis VII was furious, viewing the union as both a personal betrayal and a political disaster. He would spend the rest of his reign seeking to counter the combined might of Henry and Eleanor. When Stephen of Blois died in 1154, Henry and Eleanor sailed for England. On December 19th, 1154, they were crowned King and Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. England was still scarred by years of civil war. Castles lay in ruins. The treasury was depleted, and the authority of the crown had been deeply undermined. Yet Henry, with Eleanor at his side, set about restoring royal power with breathtaking vigor. He ordered the demolition of unauthorized castles, reasserted the king's right to justice and revenue, and brought rebellious nobles to heel. Eleanor, now Queen of England, was at the very center of this renewal. The territories ruled by Henry and Eleanor, later called the Angevin Empire, were vast. England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and in Eleanor's right, Aquitaine, Poitou, and Gascony. This patchwork of lands stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, and from the Atlantic to the Vexin. The couple ruled not as a unified nation, but as a collection of principalities, each with its own customs, laws, and lords. The challenge of governance was immense. Eleanor's role was both public and private. She was not merely a consort, but a duchess in her own right. She retained control over Aquitaine, presided over courts at Poitiers and Bordeaux, issued charters, and received homage from her vassals. In England, she acted as regent during Henry's frequent absences on the continent. She bore the burdens of queenship, managing the royal household, overseeing the upbringing of her children, and providing a model of piety and patronage. Her signature appears on royal documents, often alongside Henry's, a testament to her status as partner in rule. The royal court under Henry and Eleanor was a vibrant, cosmopolitan place. The chronicler Gerald of Wales described it as the most splendid in Christendom, a place where the sons of nobles from England, Normandy, and the south of France mingled and learned the arts of arms and letters. Eleanor brought with her the traditions of Aquitaine, the troubadours, the poetry of courtly love, and a culture that encouraged wit and learning. The young Chrétien de Troyes, whose Arthurian romances would become the model for generations, found a patron in Eleanor's circle. The court at Poitiers, especially during Eleanor's later retreats, became a legendary center of debate, song, and the invention of new codes of chivalry and romance. Family life in the Angevin court was passionate, competitive, and often riven by conflict. Between 1153 and 1167, Eleanor bore Henry 5 sons and 3 daughters: William, who died young, Henry the young king, Richard Geoffrey, Matilda, Eleanor, Joan, and John. Each of these children would become a piece on the chessboard of European politics. Henry the young king, crowned during his father's lifetime in a bid to secure the succession, was charming but feckless, always in search of funds and freedom. Richard, Eleanor's favorite, was fierce, charismatic, and already a champion in the tournaments of Aquitaine. Geoffrey, astute and handsome, became Duke of Brittany by marriage. John, the youngest, was clever and calculating, earning the nickname Lackland for his initial lack of inheritance. The Plantagenet family was as famous for its internal strife as for its external power. Henry II, energetic to the point of restlessness, was a relentless ruler and a difficult husband. He traveled constantly, seldom pausing for long in any of his castles, and was prone to rages and infidelities. His most public affair was with Rosamond Clifford, the fair Rosamond, whose secluded bower at Woodstock became a legend of medieval romance and jealousy. Eleanor, though long-suffering in the face of these betrayals, did not lack for her own admirers. Rumors swirled of platonic, and, in the minds of some chroniclers, less innocent, friendships with poets and knights in her court. Eleanor's influence extended far beyond the family. She was a shrewd diplomat, negotiating marriages for her daughters, Matilda to Henry, the Lion of Saxony, Eleanor to Alfonso VIII of Castile, and Joan to William II of Sicily. These alliances knit the Plantagenet family into the fabric of European politics. She corresponded with abbots, bishops, and secular rulers, and her surviving letters, though few, display a mastery of Latin rhetoric and a keen grasp of the political realities of her time. Yet the Angevin Empire was always fragile, held together by the will of its rulers and the intricate dance of feudal loyalty. The barons of Aquitaine were fiercely protective of their ancient privileges, and Eleanor often had to mediate between their demands and Henry's centralizing ambitions. The church, too, was a source of tension. Henry's infamous quarrel with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, once his friend and chancellor, later his bitterest foe, culminated in Becket's murder in 1170, a crime that shocked Europe and forced Henry to do penance at the shrine in Canterbury. Eleanor's position during this crisis was complex. She supported Becket's reforms, but also recognized the dangers of papal overreach. Through all of this, Eleanor retained her identity as Duchess of Aquitaine. She traveled frequently to her southern domains, presiding over courts, administering justice, and maintaining her authority among the turbulent Gascon and Poitevin lords. The chronicler Ralph of Diceto remarked, "She was more than queen, for in her own lands she was sovereign, and her word was law." The Plantagenet court, for all its splendor, was a cauldron of ambition and rivalry. By the 1170s, as Henry's sons came of age, tensions within the family erupted into open hostility. The seeds of rebellion had been sown by years of neglect, competition for lands and titles, and Henry's refusal to share power. Eleanor, always fiercely loyal to her children and to the traditions of Aquitaine, would soon find herself at the center of a revolt that would shake the foundations of her husband's empire and her own life. By the early 1170s, the Plantagenet Empire, so dazzling in its breadth and depth, began to fracture under the weight of its own ambitions. The family that ruled from the rocky coasts of Normandy to the sunlit vineyards of Aquitaine was by now notorious for its volatility. Henry II's relentless grip on power, his refusal to delegate real authority to his sons, and his notorious infidelities, both public and private, had turned the royal household into a crucible of resentment. At the heart of the coming storm was Henry the young king, crowned in 1770 as junior co-king, but denied any meaningful role in government. His charm and generosity made him popular among knights and troubadours, but he bridled at the restrictions imposed by his father. Richard, fierce and independent, ruled Aquitaine in his mother's name, but knew little peace from his father's demands or his brother's envy. Geoffrey, ambitious and cunning, was Duke of Brittany by marriage, but always wary of his place in the succession. John, youngest, cleverest, and most neglected, hovered on the margins, learning the arts of patience, manipulation, and survival. Eleanor's position in this household was unique and perilous. She was both queen and duchess, mother and political actor, and the one person capable of commanding the loyalty of the southern barons. Her sympathies lay with her sons, especially with Richard, who shared her love for Aquitaine and her impatience with Henry's autocracy. Chroniclers would later speculate on her role. Did she incite her sons to rebellion, or was she simply swept up in the tide of their ambitions? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. In 1173, The latent discontent erupted into open revolt. The young king, frustrated by his father's intransigence, fled to the court of Louis VII in Paris, Eleanor's former husband, and by now a long-standing rival of Henry II. Louis welcomed the fugitive princes. Seeing an opportunity to break the power of the Angevin Empire, Richard and Geoffrey soon joined their brother, and the rebellion spread like wildfire. Barons from Aquitaine, Brittany, and Anjou rallied to the prince's cause, hoping to restore old liberties and check the king's authority. William the Lion, King of Scots, invaded northern England, while Philip of Flanders sent troops to Normandy. Eleanor's involvement was bold and unmistakable. She summoned her Aquitanian vassals, urged them to support the revolt, and was widely believed to have coordinated strategy with her sons and with Louis VII. In a world where women were expected to be passive, her actions were nothing short of revolutionary. The chronicler Ralph of Diceto recorded, "The queen, more valiant than any man, became the soul of resistance in the south." She is said to have appeared at Poitiers in armor, addressing her knights, promising liberty and restoration of ancient customs. But the rebellion, despite its initial successes, soon faltered. Henry II, ruthless and energetic as ever, moved swiftly to divide his enemies, buying off some, crushing others. Royal armies swept through Maine and Brittany, while loyalist forces in England repelled the Scots and the northern rebels. The turning point came in the autumn of 1173, when Eleanor, attempting to join her sons in Paris, was intercepted near the border, disguised in men's clothing. Her capture was a sensation. A queen caught in rebellion against her king, a mother supporting her sons against their father. Henry II did not hesitate. He ordered Eleanor confined first in the dungeons of Chinon, then at Salisbury, and finally in a succession of royal castles, Winchester, Old Sarum, and others, scattered across England. The conditions of her captivity varied. Sometimes she was closely guarded, other times allowed a small household and limited freedoms. She attended Christmas court, always under guard, forced to watch her family's celebrations as an outsider. She was given books, permitted to hear Mass, and allowed correspondence with her children, but all under the king's watchful eye. The years of Eleanor's imprisonment, nearly 16 in all, were a time of profound isolation and reflection. Yet she was never entirely powerless. She maintained contact with her loyal vassals in Aquitaine, advised her sons by letter, and according to some accounts, acted as a silent force in the politics of the realm. Chroniclers note her dignity and resilience. The anonymous author of the Dialogues de Scaccario wrote, "The queen, though caged, was never tamed. Her mind was as sharp as her sorrow was deep." The cost of rebellion was high. The young king died in 1183, worn down by disappointment, extravagance, and dysentery. His last wish was for forgiveness from his father and the return of his mother's ring. Geoffrey perished in a tournament in Paris in 1186, leaving behind a widow and a posthumous son, Arthur of Brittany. Richard, now his father's heir, spent the next years in intermittent war against Henry and his own brothers. John, ever the opportunist, shifted his allegiances as the winds blew. Eleanor's absence from court life was keenly felt. The Plantagenet Empire, built on a web of feudal loyalties and personal relationships, began to unravel without her mediation. Old disputes flared among the barons of Aquitaine, while in England, Henry's increasing reliance on foreign mercenaries and his own temper alienated much of the nobility. The church, too, remained wary. After Becket's murder, Henry's piety was suspect, and Eleanor's patronage of monastic reform in Aquitaine contrasted sharply with the king's more pragmatic approach. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor's legend grew. Troubadours sang of her courage, her beauty, and her sorrow. Chroniclers recorded her as both a tragic heroine and a dangerous rebel. In her letters, few survive, but many are referenced. She consoled her daughters, guided her surviving sons, and reminded her vassals of their oaths. The abbeys at Fontevraud and Poitiers, which she had long patronized, became centers of prayer for her release. The final years of Henry II's reign were marked by increasing isolation and despair. The king, exhausted by decades of conflict, was betrayed at the last by John, his youngest and once favored son, who conspired with Richard and Philip II of France. When Henry died at Chinon in July 1189, abandoned and embittered, his last words were said to be a curse upon his sons. Eleanor, now in her mid-60s, was at last released from captivity by her favorite son, Richard. The world she re-entered was one she had helped shape, scarred by war, but alive with the possibility of renewal. Her courage, intelligence, and resilience had survived not only the trials of rebellion, but the long, cold years of imprisonment. In the chronicles of her time, as in the memories of her children and subjects, Eleanor of Aquitaine was already more than a queen. She was a legend, and her true work was not yet done. Richard the Lionheart's first act as king was to free his mother. The gates of Eleanor's captivity swung open, and she emerged into the light, her dignity undiminished by 16 years of confinement. Chroniclers across Europe marveled at her resilience. The Normans called her the Great Lady, and the southern troubadours, who never forgot her patronage, composed songs celebrating her return. In 1189, Eleanor was in her mid-60s, but age had not softened her intellect, nor dulled her grasp of power. She rode with Richard to Winchester for his coronation, the crowds thronging the streets to catch a glimpse of the legendary queen who had outlived 2 husbands and survived the storms of rebellion. Her presence at court signaled a new era. Not only was she restored to her lands and revenues, but she was once again at the heart of Plantagenet politics. Richard, ever the knight-errant, was soon consumed by his greatest ambition, the Third Crusade. He left England within a year of his accession, determined to win glory in the Holy Land and to fulfill the vow that had haunted him since childhood. In his absence, he named Eleanor as regent, entrusting her with the defense and governance of his sprawling domains. Eleanor's regency was a marvel of energy and diplomacy. She presided over great councils at Westminster and Rouen, resolved disputes between quarrelsome barons, and kept the royal treasury solvent through careful management and negotiation. She understood the dangers of Richard's absence. His brother John, left behind in England, was already conspiring with Philip II of France, hoping to seize the throne for himself. Eleanor moved swiftly to counter John's ambitions, summoning loyal magnates, negotiating truces with Welsh and Scottish lords, and dispatching trusted agents to keep watch over her youngest son. Her correspondence from this period shows the breadth of her influence. Letters flew between Eleanor and the papal court in Rome, the kings of Castile and Navarre, and the abbesses of Fontevraud and Poitiers. She advised her daughters, now queens in their own right, Joan in Sicily and Eleanor in Castile, on matters both political and personal. The chronicler Roger of Howden described her as the mother of kings, the arbiter of princes, the peacemaker of Christendom. The crisis of Richard's captivity tested all of Eleanor's formidable skills. In 1192, as the king returned from the Crusade, he was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria and handed over to Emperor Henry VI. The ransom demanded for Richard's release was astronomical, 150,000 marks, equal to several years' revenue for the entire kingdom. Eleanor, now nearly 70, led the effort to raise the sum. She called councils at London, York, and Bordeaux. She levied taxes, sold off royal lands, and even emptied her own coffers to secure her son's freedom. Monks and peasants, knights and merchants, all contributed to the king's ransom, a testament to Eleanor's powers of persuasion and her enduring authority. She personally traveled to Germany to negotiate with the emperor, braving the winter snows and the dangers of banditry and political intrigue. Chroniclers record that the sight of the aged queen, still commanding and eloquent, moved even the hardened courtiers of the imperial court. When Richard finally returned to England in 1194, it was to his mother that he first offered thanks. Their reunion, held in the Great Hall at Winchester, became the subject of poetry and song. Yet Eleanor's burdens were not over. Richard spent most of the remaining years of his reign campaigning in France, defending his continental lands against Philip II. Eleanor remained his chief advisor, negotiating with rebellious vassals, arranging marriages, and even traveling across the Pyrenees to select a bride for his nephew, Blanche of Castile. When Richard died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during the siege of Chalus-Chabrol, Eleanor was once again faced with the crisis of succession. John, the last surviving son, was a problematic heir. He was clever, learned, and charming, but also deeply suspicious, impulsive, and prone to cruelty. Many in Aquitaine and Normandy preferred Arthur of Brittany, Geoffrey's orphaned son, but Eleanor threw her formidable support behind John. She journeyed to Anjou, Poitou, and Gascony, summoning barons and bishops, securing oaths of loyalty, and suppressing dissent. Her reputation as a ruler, just, but severe when necessary, ensured that the Plantagenet inheritance did not dissolve in civil war. The new king relied heavily on his mother's advice in the early years of his reign. Eleanor arranged the marriage of John to Isabella of Angoulême, securing the loyalty of a key vassal. She mediated disputes with the French crown and continued to act as a patroness of letters and reform. Even as her strength declined, she remained a formidable presence at court, respected and feared by allies and enemies alike. In her final years, Eleanor retired to Fontevraud Abbey, the spiritual heart of her family. The abbey was a place of learning and contemplation, favored by Plantagenet queens and princesses for generations. Here, Eleanor donned the simple habit of a nun, but she did not relinquish her role as counselor and matriarch. She received ambassadors from England, France, Castile, and Sicily, advised the abbess on affairs both sacred and secular, and corresponded with her grandchildren, shaping the destinies of the next generation. Even in old age, her influence radiated outward. The chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall marveled at her stamina. She was a woman of iron, whose heart knew neither fear nor fatigue. Pilgrims and poets journeyed to Fontevraud to seek her blessing, and the abbey's halls rang with the echoes of her laughter and her wisdom. In 1202, when war threatened to tear Aquitaine apart, she emerged briefly from retirement to negotiate peace between rival factions, a final act of service to the land she had loved since childhood. On April 1st, 1204, Eleanor of Aquitaine died, surrounded by her nuns and the daughters of her house. She was in her early 80s, an astonishing age for her era, and at her side were the symbols of her faith and her lineage: a crucifix, a ring, and a letter from her son John. She was buried at Fontevraud, beside Henry II, and Richard, her effigy serene, hands folded in prayer, the lines of her face carved with both sorrow and majesty. The news of her death reverberated through the courts of Europe. Kings and queens sent letters of condolence. Monasteries held vigils in her memory. Troubadours composed laments for the greatest lady of their age. In the words of the chronicler William Marshall, the world had lost its star, and the courts of love their queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine's death did not silence her voice. If anything, it marked the beginning of a second spectral reign, a reign over memory, legend, and the chronicler's pens. For nearly a millennium, her image has flickered in the imagination of Europe: queen, rebel, patroness, mother, and muse. Her legend grew in the retelling, as inexhaustible as the rivers of her native Aquitaine. Contemporary chroniclers, with their own prejudices and agendas, could not agree on how to judge her. Some, like Roger of Hoveden, admired her undaunted soul and queenly bearing. Others, like the monkish Gervais of Canterbury, painted her as a serpent in the nest of kings, more cunning than most men, more ambitious than is seemly for her sex. The ambiguity is telling, for Eleanor defied the categories of her age. She was at once a loving mother and a political schemer, a patron of beauty and a wielder of power, a woman both admired and feared. Perhaps nowhere was her influence felt more keenly than in the culture of chivalry and courtly love. The courts of Poitiers and Bordeaux, under her patronage, became crucibles where the ideals of fin amour were shaped and refined. Troubadours, like Bernard de Ventadour, composed verses in her honor, comparing her to the rose, the hawk, the star that guides the night. The legendary courts of love, whether literal or allegorical, echoed with debates on the nature of desire, the duties of knights, and the freedoms of women, in an age when most noble women were confined to the margins. Eleanor insisted on a place at the center. This vision of romantic love, filtered through the poetry of Chrétien de Troyes and Marie de France, changed the texture of European literature. The stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, borrowed their shape from the world Eleanor nurtured. In these tales, love was not merely a duty or transaction, but a force to be reckoned with, a source of joy, sorrow, and rebellion. Through her, the medieval imagination learned to celebrate longing, to question authority, to see women as arbiters of worth. Her political legacy was no less profound. As queen of both France and England, Eleanor was a living bridge between cultures, a diplomat whose alliances shaped the fate of nations. Twice she ruled as regent, first in England, later in her own Aquitaine, and for her sons. She maneuvered through wars, betrayals, and shifting allegiances with a shrewdness that left even her enemies wary. Her correspondence, fragments of which survive in archives from Westminster to Salamanca, reveal a mind perpetually engaged with the affairs of Europe, a woman who understood the nuances of power in ways that would have been the envy of any king. Yet her greatest legacy may be her children. Through Richard the Lionheart, the ideal of the crusading king was cast for centuries to come, noble, fierce, and tragic. Through John, the darker legacy of Plantagenet ambition would lead to Magna Carta and the birth of English constitutionalism. Through her daughters, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan, she seeded the royal houses of Castile, Sicily, and Toulouse, scattering her lineage across the continent. In every generation, her descendants struggled with the burdens of inheritance, the aching need for unity, and the restless spirit that was Eleanor's gift and curse. Over the centuries, Eleanor's image has been endlessly remade. In the medieval chronicles, she was sometimes the dangerous woman, the Eve who tempted men to ruin, the Jezebel whose ambition brought down kings. In the Renaissance, her legend faded, overshadowed by newer queens and heroines. But in the Victorian age, as poets and novelists rediscovered the romance of the Middle Ages, Eleanor emerged once more, cloaked in nostalgia and longing. The Pre-Raphaelites painted her as a tragic beauty, her face grave and luminous, amid tangled roses. Writers from Alfred, Lord Tennyson, to Mark Twain invoked her as the symbol of a lost golden age. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians and novelists alike have sought to reclaim her complexity. She is no longer merely the mother of kings or the pawn of dynastic ambition, but a figure in her own right, a woman who navigated the labyrinth of medieval politics with wit, courage, and vision. Scholars pore over the margins of charters and letters for her traces, while filmmakers and playwrights reimagine her voice for new generations. In historical fiction, she has been cast as heroine and anti-heroine, victim and mastermind, lover and strategist. The myths that cling to Eleanor, her supposed poisoning of Rosamund Clifford, her presiding over the courts of love, her secret liaisons and whispered intrigues speak less to the facts of her life than to the enduring fascination she inspires. Even the stones of Fontevraud, where her effigy lies beside those of Henry and Richard, seem to guard their secrets. Pilgrims still come to gaze upon her calm, prayerful face. In the silence of the abbey, her story lingers like incense. Yet to dwell only on the myth is to miss the true miracle of Eleanor's life. For nearly 80 years, she moved at the heart of power, enduring triumph and tragedy, exile and restoration. She shaped the destinies of empires, molded the ideals of a civilization, and perhaps most remarkably, remained herself, quick-witted, indomitable, never content to simply endure. In an age that sought to constrain women, she burst her bonds again and again, defying the world to forget her. She was and remains one of the most remarkable figures of the Middle Ages, a woman whose life reads not only as history, but as epic, as legend, as the song of a troubadour echoing down the centuries. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess and Queen, Mother and Regent, prisoner and legend. Her shadow falls across the centuries, and in the long halls of memory, her voice still calls us to imagine what is possible, even in the most unlikely of times.